A young woman married a wealthy man to escape poverty. But upon discovering what he did at night, she immediately called the police. Valeria stared at the wall clock in the kitchen, listening to the incessant drip of the faucet that no one had time or money to fix. Time moved slowly in her home, a small house filled with love and sacrifices. Her parents, Mark and Elena, sat at the table, whispering about the mounting bills, a burden that felt like a noose around the family's neck. At 25, Valeria felt the weight of the world on her shoulders. "I have to get to work," she finally said, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had settled in the room. Her mother looked up and gave her a weary smile, one of those smiles that tried to mask the constant pain and worry surrounding them. Elena was the pillar of the family, a strong woman who never showed weakness, but Valeria could see the exhaustion in her eyes. "Take care, my daughter," her mother replied. "We'll see you tonight." Valeria nodded and left the house, feeling the fresh air of the modest neighborhood where she had grown up. The dusty streets were alive with children running around and neighbors greeting one another, but for her, that environment represented everything she wanted to leave behind. She had lived her entire life there, but the future she had always dreamed of seemed farther away than ever. The short walk to her job at the clothing store was just enough time for dark thoughts to flood her mind. "Is this my life?" she wondered over and over. The clothing store in the mall barely paid her minimum wage, just enough to cover her personal expenses, while her parents struggled to keep the household afloat. Her father, Mark, a hard-working man, had reduced his hours at the factory due to his deteriorating health. Each time she saw him cough or limp, her heart ached. Upon arriving at the store, Valeria immediately got to work, attending to customers and organizing the merchandise, but her mind was elsewhere. Hours passed, yet the weight of her reality still pressed down on her. Superficial conversations with customers didn't distract her from the constant reminder of her situation. That same day, in the midst of her routine, her boss mentioned that the mall was hosting a charity event and needed volunteers. Without hesitation, Valeria agreed to help. It wasn't much, but any opportunity to do something different, something that would pull her out of her daily monotony, was welcome. That afternoon, at the charity event, Valeria couldn't help but notice the stark contrast between the attendees. Wealthy families strolled through the hall, chatting with a carefree demeanor she didn't know, setting her apart from her own reality. She felt like an outsider, yet at the same time, she was fascinated by this lifestyle that seemed so distant and unattainable. Amidst that feeling of disconnect, something unexpected happened. While serving drinks to guests, she saw a striking man in his 40s enter the hall. Dressed in a sharp black suit, he exuded a presence that commanded attention. His stride was confident, and his face, though handsome, bore a seriousness that intimidated. Julius. The name spread among the attendees like wildfire. Valeria didn't know who he was, but soon she overheard whispers about him. "He owns several businesses. He has more money than you can imagine. He always attends these events to make generous donations," they said. At first, Valeria didn't look directly at him, but when their eyes met, she felt a strange shiver run down her spine. Julius studied her for a moment longer than any customer would, with an intensity that made her blush. She wasn't used to that kind of attention, especially not from such a powerful man. Minutes later, as she was collecting empty glasses from a nearby table, she felt his presence beside her. "Hi," Julius said, his voice smooth yet firm. "What's your name?" Valeria, surprised that he was speaking to her, responded timidly. "Valeria." "Nice to meet you, Valeria." His smile was charming, but there was something in his gaze that sparked both curiosity and unease within her. "I don't think I've seen you at these events before." "This is my first time volunteering," she replied, still taken aback by the interaction. Julius assessed her from head to toe, not lewdly, but as if evaluating her. There was something intriguing about him, a sense of mystery that drew her in inexplicably. Valeria felt out of place in that environment, yet Julius's presence made her think for a moment that perhaps there was more for her, something beyond the life of sacrifice and poverty she had known. Throughout the rest of the event, Julius kept watching her. When it ended, he approached her again and asked for her number. Valeria hesitated for a second, but something inside her, perhaps the desperation to escape her current life, pushed her to say yes. That night, as she returned home, Valeria couldn't stop thinking about him. She wondered if this encounter was the beginning of something significant, something that could change her life forever. In the solitude of her room, staring at the ceiling, she began to dream of the possibility that, at last, luck might be on her side. Her parents, unaware of everything, continued struggling with bills and financial strain. Mark coughed in the living room, while Elena went over the accounts again, oblivious to what was about to unfold. But that night, Valeria felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. A dangerous hope, one that would soon pull her into a world far darker than she could ever have imagined. In the days following her encounter with Julius, Valeria experienced a mix of confusion and excitement. She couldn't shake the image of that impressive and elegant man from her mind, nor his unexpected proposal to see her again. It was a world completely foreign to hers, and that difference made her dream of a life that until then had seemed impossible. One afternoon, as she returned from her shift at the store, she received a message from Julius. "Would you like to have dinner with me tonight?" Valeria read the message several times, unable to believe that this man, so far removed from her reality, genuinely wanted to get to know her better. After a few minutes of hesitation, she accepted. Perhaps it was the opportunity she had been waiting for to break free from the cycle of poverty that had defined her life. Her first dinner with Julius was a dream. He took her to an upscale restaurant she had only seen in magazines and on TV. Upon entering, Valeria felt intimidated by the opulence of the place, the mirrored walls, the crystal chandeliers, and the impeccably dressed customers speaking softly, exuding the calm of those who have never had to worry about money. She felt small, out of place, yet there was something exhilarating about being there. Julius, for his part, epitomized confidence. He looked at her with a blend of interest and patience, as if he enjoyed seeing her mesmerized by a world he knew so well. During dinner, he spoke little about himself, but when he did, his words were filled with certainty. He talked about his businesses with a calmness that seemed almost surreal to Valeria. Everything about him was controlled and calculated, as if every movement, every word, was perfectly planned. Valeria, on the other hand, tried not to show how impressed she was, even though inside she felt like a child stepping into a fairy tale. "Tell me, Valeria," Julius asked, interrupting the monologue of her thoughts. "What is your life like? Share with me about yourself." The question threw her for a moment. No one had ever asked her about her life with such genuine interest. The people around her already knew the struggles, the financial problems, the daily battles, the family sacrifices. But this man, who had everything, was genuinely interested in hearing her story. "Well," Valeria hesitated, "there's not much to tell. I live with my parents and work at a clothing store. I try to help out at home, but it's not easy. My dad is sick and—" She paused, realizing how inappropriate it felt to discuss financial troubles in a place like this. Julius, however, didn't interrupt her. He listened, and his eyes, though cool, seemed to be calculating something beyond her words. "You must have worked very hard," he remarked with a slight smile. "That's admirable." The conversation continued, and slowly Valeria began to relax. She felt flattered by Julius's attention, by his interest in her, someone so ordinary. And when dinner ended, he insisted on driving her home in his luxury car. As they drove through the city, the lights flashing past, Valeria started to feel that maybe, just maybe, there was a way out of the life she knew. The dates continued. In the following weeks, Julius took her to other exclusive restaurants, gifted her expensive dresses, and introduced her to a lifestyle that Valeria had never imagined she could experience. Although the relationship progressed quickly, she never felt pressured. On the contrary, Julius seemed to know exactly how to seduce her, how to make her feel comfortable in this new world of luxury. However, there was something that made her uneasy: the speed at which everything was happening. Julius proposed more and more, and while Valeria enjoyed the luxury and attention, she couldn't shake the feeling that all of this was too good to be true. One night, after an especially lavish dinner, Julius made a proposal that left her speechless. "I want you to move in with me," he said casually while they enjoyed dessert. "You don't have to keep struggling. You can quit your job and just enjoy life." Valeria fell silent, taken aback by the suggestion. She wasn't in love with Julius, not in the traditional romantic sense, but the offer was tempting, very tempting. Her life until that moment had been a constant struggle, and the idea of leaving that burden behind felt almost like a dream. That night, upon returning home, Valeria spoke to her parents about Julius's offer. Her father, Mark, with his tired gaze and body weakened by years of labor, encouraged her to accept. "It's an opportunity you can't pass up, daughter. Julius can give you everything I never could. If he offers you a better life, take it." Her mother, Elena, on the other hand, was more reserved. Though she said little, Valeria noticed the concern in her eyes. Elena didn't trust sudden changes or easy solutions. There was something about Julius that she didn't like, but she didn't dare to tell her daughter directly. "Just be careful," her mother said gently. "Sometimes, what seems perfect isn't." Valeria knew this. Deep down, something inside her whispered that things were moving too quickly, but the desperation to escape her life, to give her family a chance at stability, was stronger than any internal warning. The wedding was arranged quickly. Without grand ceremonies or many guests, Valeria and Julius married in a discreet civil registry office. For many, it was a surprise how fast everything happened, but for Valeria, it represented the end of a chapter of sacrifices and the beginning of a new life filled with comforts. Looking at her parents after the ceremony, Valeria felt a mix of emotions. Her father, with tears in his eyes, seemed proud and relieved that his daughter finally had a chance to live better. Her mother, however, hugged her tighter than usual, as if she knew this marriage wouldn't be the fairy tale Valeria imagined. A few weeks later, Valeria moved into Julius's mansion, an imposing property that marked a clear break from her previous life. Upon entering, the house greeted her with a chilling silence, as if waiting for the secrets hidden within its walls to begin revealing themselves. The mansion's door closed behind Valeria with a deep echo. The silence enveloping her was suffocating, contrasting with the cacophony of sounds and voices that always filled her family home. The high walls, the spacious corridors adorned with art, and the luxurious furnishings seemed to welcome her into a life that had only recently been part of her dreams. And yet, this new home, filled with unimaginable luxuries, felt strangely cold to her. Valeria looked around, trying to grasp how quickly her life had changed. The previous days had passed in a whirlwind of rushed decisions and a wedding that felt almost unreal. The mansion, which was supposed to symbolize her new beginning, now felt like a gilded prison. The day after her arrival, Julius was already busy with his businesses. He left early without giving her much explanation. "Work matters," he had said casually, as if those words were enough to reassure her. Valeria, hoping to spend her first day of marriage with him, felt disappointed, although she tried not to dwell on it. She thought perhaps it was an urgent matter, and they would soon have time together. She explored the mansion to familiarize herself with her new home. Each room seemed more extravagant than the last. Enormous windows, carpets that absorbed the sound of her footsteps, sculptures and paintings by artists she didn't even recognize. She walked through the halls with a mix of fascination and strangeness, as if she were touring a museum rather than her home. Finally, she reached the kitchen, where she met Margaret, the housekeeper. She was a woman in her 50s, with impeccable posture and a serious but polite expression. Margaret had worked in the mansion for many years, and while she seemed friendly, there was an evident distance. "Mrs. Valeria," Margaret said with a slight bow, "if you need anything, don't hesitate to let me know." Valeria smiled at her, feeling uncomfortable with the formality. "Thank you, Margaret. I'm not used to so much grandeur. I'm still adjusting." Margaret didn't respond immediately, but Valeria noticed a fleeting shadow cross her face. It was a brief moment, but enough for Valeria to sense there was something more behind the polished perfection of the mansion. As the days went by, Valeria tried to enjoy the comforts now at her disposal. Expensive clothes, dinners served with almost military precision by the staff, and the freedom from worrying about money were advantages she had only dreamed of before. However, she soon began to feel the emptiness behind all those luxuries. Julius remained distant, though he was always attentive in material ways. He bought her everything she desired, took her to exclusive restaurants and social events, but their conversations stayed on the surface. Valeria tried to talk about her past, her family, but Julius never seemed interested in delving deeper. He avoided personal conversations and simply asked if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. It was as if, instead of a wife, Valeria were just another piece in his collection of valuable objects. The nights grew lonelier. Julius began to disappear more often, leaving her alone in the vast mansion. At first, Valeria tried not to think much of it. It must be work, she told herself over and over. But the nights felt long, and the absence of her husband began to weigh on her. She would wake in the middle of the night, noticing the other half of the bed was still empty. The silences in the house became increasingly oppressive, and the feeling of loneliness grew stronger. One night, unable to sleep, Valeria went down to the kitchen to get herself a drink. While waiting for the water to boil, she looked out the window at the expansive garden surrounding the mansion. Shadows danced with the wind, creating strange shapes in the darkness. And then she felt it. A presence, an emptiness. The mansion, no matter how luxurious and perfect, had something unsettling about it. Something that made her feel watched, as if those walls harbored secrets she had yet to uncover. Julius's behavior didn't help. Whenever Valeria tried to ask him about his constant late-night outings, he would divert the conversation with vague responses. "It's work matters, my love," he'd say with a charming smile, but his eyes never showed true warmth. Julius's absences grew longer and more frequent. Valeria tried to maintain a calm facade to enjoy the luxury surrounding her, but doubts began to creep into her mind. Why was he disappearing so much? What kind of business kept him out until the early hours? There was something unsettling about his behavior, though she couldn't pinpoint what it was. One afternoon, while wandering through the mansion, Valeria discovered something that heightened her suspicions. There was a wing of the house that Julius never mentioned. At first, Valeria hadn't paid much attention, but now, with so many hours to explore, her curiosity was piqued. As she walked through the less trafficked hallways of that part of the mansion, she found a locked door. At first glance, it didn't seem special, but there was something about that door, in its isolated location, that sent a shiver down Valeria's spine. She tried to turn the knob, but it was firmly locked. Why was this door closed in such a large house where every other room was open and accessible? She decided not to mention it to Julius, but the unease continued to grow within her. That door seemed like a small glimpse into the secrets she had yet to uncover. That very night, Julius returned late, much later than usual. Valeria, sitting on the edge of the bed, waited for him, trying to appear calm, even though her thoughts were in turmoil. Julius entered the room with the same confident smile as always, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. But Valeria could no longer ignore what she felt. "Where have you been?" she asked, her tone sounding firmer than she had intended. Julius raised an eyebrow and stopped in front of her. The tension in the room was palpable. He took his time before answering, as if measuring each word. "I told you, my love. Work." He responded softly, but the way he avoided looking her directly in the eye made her even more uncomfortable. Valeria sighed, knowing she wouldn't get any more answers that night. Julius kissed her on the forehead and headed to the bathroom, leaving her alone on the bed, her mind filled with questions. The coldness between them began to increase. Although Valeria had everything she had always desired materially, her relationship with Julius was marked by an emotional distance that made her feel lonely, even when he was present. The lavish dinners, the trips, the jewelry, and the clothes no longer filled the emptiness she felt inside. The mansion, which at first represented an escape from her previous life, now felt like a decorated prison. Valeria started noticing more things that troubled her, the way the household staff seemed to avoid mentioning Julius, or how Margaret, the housekeeper, maintained a respectful yet tense distance when talking about her boss. There was an air of mystery in every corner of the mansion, a sense that, although she was surrounded by luxuries, she had no idea about the life her husband led outside those walls. And so, as loneliness grew within her, Valeria began to comprehend a painful truth. The dream of escaping poverty had led her to a gilded cage, where the secrets of her husband were the bars that kept her trapped. Uncertainty became a constant companion for Valeria. The nights in the mansion were long and lonely, and Julius's absence weighed heavier each time. She wondered if she truly knew the man she had married. Although Julius had dazzled her with his charm and lifestyle, something about his behavior made her uneasy. The evasive answers, the unexplained outings, and the emotional distance piled up in her mind like a puzzle she couldn't solve. One afternoon, while wandering through the mansion in search of something to distract her, she decided to seek out Margaret, the housekeeper. On several occasions, Valeria had sensed that Margaret knew more than she let on. Perhaps in her silence, there was some clue about Julius's true character. "Margaret," Valeria said, finding her in the kitchen, "can we talk for a moment?" Margaret looked up, slightly surprised by the request. She dried her hands on a towel and nodded, leading Valeria to a small sitting room. "What's going on, Mrs. Valeria?" she asked in a neutral voice, though her eyes showed a glimmer of curiosity. Valeria felt her heart racing. She didn't want to sound like she was accusing Julius, but the need to vent was overwhelming. "I've noticed that Julius isn't always here at night. I worry about his work, but when I ask him, he always changes the subject. I don't know if I'm being paranoid, but..." She paused, searching for the right words. "I feel lonely." Margaret looked at her for a moment that felt eternal. Finally, she sighed and sat down, as if preparing her mind for a revelation. "It's normal to feel that way, Valeria," she said softly. "The first few weeks in a new home are always difficult. But Julius, he has his own life." "What do you mean by that?" Valeria asked, feeling that something in Margaret's voice was putting her on alert. "I can't talk much about his personal life," Margaret replied, looking down, "but there are things I've seen over the years, things that have made me doubt." Valeria's heart stopped for an instant. What had Margaret seen? "Do you know anything about Julius's other wives?" she dared to ask, recalling the comment Margaret had made during their first conversation. Margaret hesitated, biting her lower lip, and then finally spoke in a low voice. "I haven't been here when they've left, but I've heard whispers. Julius's previous wives. Some of them showed unease at some point, but they never said anything, as if they understood there were secrets better left undisclosed." Valeria felt a shiver run down her spine. The unease she had felt since moving into the mansion grew with every word Margaret spoke. What secrets did Julius keep? "Why didn't you tell me this before?" she asked, almost in a whisper. "I can't interfere in his life, Valeria, but—" Margaret leaned toward her, her eyes showing a glimmer of compassion. "You must be careful. Julius is a very influential man, and sometimes those men hide dark things." Valeria felt her heart sink. The reality of her situation was beginning to turn terrifying. As she looked at Margaret, she realized she had been searching for answers, but now she feared what she might discover. The conversation with Margaret left a profound mark on her mind. That night, while Julius was out again, Valeria couldn't help but seek a distraction. She sat on her bed, the dim light from the lamp illuminating the shadows in the room. She decided she could no longer live in uncertainty. She had to find the truth about her husband. With her heart racing, Valeria got up and began to explore the mansion once more, this time with a defined purpose. The thought of the locked door haunted her, echoing persistently in her mind. What was behind it? She headed toward the wing of the house she had avoided. As she reached the door, her heart pounded. She paused for a moment, wondering if she really wanted to discover what lay on the other side. However, curiosity outweighed fear. She reached for the knob and turned it, but the door remained locked. It was a physical barrier, but also a symbol of all the secrets Julius was hiding. With growing determination, she decided she couldn't give up. She couldn't continue like this, trapped in a life that seemed perfect, but was, at its core, filled with darkness. The nights continued to pass, and Julius kept disappearing. Valeria tried to distract herself with the household staff and the comforts surrounding her, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The mansion, which had initially represented a refuge, had become a maze of uncertainty. One night, while sitting alone in the living room, she felt the urge to keep investigating. She stood up and approached Julius's desk, where some documents were left scattered. She rummaged through them, but found nothing that shed light on his secrets. However, in a corner of the drawer, she found a small notebook. She pulled it out, feeling her pulse quicken. She opened the pages, and although mostly blank, she found some handwritten notes. Random words that seemed to refer to places and people. Phrases that stirred her anxiety. Among them, she saw names and figures she didn't understand, but that sounded dangerous. Her mind began to race. What did those names mean? Was this evidence that Julius was involved in something illegal? Valeria closed the notebook and felt her world begin to sway. The idea that Julius could be entangled in a shady business loomed over her like a threatening shadow. That night, Valeria decided she could no longer be a victim of her own life. Loneliness, fear, and uncertainty were consuming her. She knew she had to confront Julius, even if it meant risking everything. The next day, as Julius returned home, Valeria waited for him with a restless mind and a racing heart. She was no longer going to remain silent. The unease had brought her to a breaking point. She needed to know the truth, no matter the cost. When Julius entered, Valeria stood in front of him, determined to confront him. "We need to talk," she said firmly, feeling fear transform into determination. Valeria took a deep breath, trying to calm the trembling in her hands. Her heart raced as she looked at Julius, who, upon entering the room, dropped his coat and paused, surprised by the expression on her face. There was something in her gaze that made him frown, as if he sensed something was amiss. "What's wrong, my love?" Julius asked, trying to adopt a casual tone, but Valeria could hear the tension in his voice. She steeled herself. She had been preparing for this moment, but now that she was facing him, the words seemed to escape her mind. However, she knew she couldn't back down. She had to confront the truth. "I've been thinking," she began, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've noticed you disappear at night, and Margaret told me that Julius's other wives showed unease. I want to know what's going on." Julius's reaction was immediate. His expression shifted from surprise to a calculated coldness in seconds. Valeria felt a chill run down her spine. "Margaret," he repeated, almost with disdain. "You shouldn't trust what she says." Valeria felt the discomfort grow. Julius had changed. He used to be charming and charismatic. Now there was an air of threat in his posture. "It's not just that," Valeria continued, feeling her determination waver slightly in the face of his intensity. "I want to know what you're doing when you're not here. Why won't you tell me the truth?" Julius stepped closer to her, and though he tried to remain calm, Valeria couldn't help but take a step back. The look in his eyes darkened, as if he were weighing each of her words. "There are things you don't need to involve yourself in, Valeria," he said, his tone low and threatening. "You must trust me. I'm your husband. I want to protect you." "Protect me from what?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm tired of living in uncertainty. What I found on your desk, those names, what do they mean?" Julius's fury erupted immediately. A flash of anger crossed his face, and his voice grew louder. "Don't get involved in what you don't understand," he growled. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Valeria felt her heart sink. She had crossed a line she should never have crossed, but it was too late to turn back. She had found something she couldn't ignore. "I need answers," she said, trying to hold on to the trust she had left. "Whatever you're doing, I need you to tell me." Julius took a step back. His expression changed, and for a moment, Valeria thought she would see a spark of vulnerability in his eyes. But it quickly closed off again, turning into a wall of ice. "If you can't accept my life and the decisions I've made, maybe you should reconsider our relationship," Julius said, letting those words drop like a blow. Valeria felt her world crumble. Was this really what he wanted? The possibility of losing everything filled her with fear, yet her instincts told her she couldn't continue ignoring the warning signs. "No, I don't want this to end. But I need to know there are no secrets between us. I need to trust you." Julius turned and left the room without answering. The echo of his footsteps resonated in the empty mansion, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The tension in the air was almost palpable. Valeria knew there was something dark in Julius's life, something he refused to share. That night, as loneliness settled in the house, Valeria made a decision. She could wait no longer. The unease in her heart drove her to do something she had feared since arriving at the mansion. She dressed in comfortable clothes and decided to follow Julius. She had to uncover the truth for herself. As the night grew darker, Valeria quietly slipped out of the mansion, staying in the shadows. The city lights illuminated her path as she trailed Julius's car, keeping a safe distance. Adrenaline coursed through her veins, mixing with fear and anxiety. She didn't know what she might discover, but she couldn't keep living in uncertainty. Finally, Julius stopped in a neighborhood Valeria didn't recognize, a place that seemed much darker and more dangerous than her elegant mansion. The facade of opulence faded away, replaced by an air of secrecy. Valeria hid behind a vehicle, her heart pounding as she watched. Julius got out of the car and joined a group of men waiting on the corner. At first, she couldn't distinguish what they were saying, but the atmosphere felt tense. As Valeria tried to hold her breath, her mind began to race. What was Julius doing in a place like this? As the men exchanged glances, Valeria felt something inside her freeze. The shadows of the night stretched longer, and the reality of her situation became increasingly terrifying. She watched Julius speak with them, his confident posture and booming laughter resonating in the darkness. Then horror gripped her. Valeria watched as a group of women and children emerged from the shadows, being forcefully herded into vans. The sight left her frozen. Julius was not just a corrupt businessman. He was involved in a human trafficking ring. The reality hit her with the force of a lightning bolt. The man she believed had saved her from poverty was, in fact, a criminal. She couldn't move. The horror held her in place. Everything she had thought about her life, about her marriage, was crumbling before her eyes. When Julius finally left in his car, Valeria felt her world dissolve. She returned to the mansion feeling as though she had left part of herself in the darkness. What had begun as a dream of escape had now turned into a nightmare. Standing in front of the door to her new home, Valeria felt utterly devastated. The mansion that once represented a bright future now felt like a prison. Her mind spun, trying to process the horrendous truth she had uncovered. She locked herself in her room, trembling. What was she to do? She had crossed a threshold she couldn't undo. The life she had chosen, in which she had placed so much hope, was now a deception that could cost her her life. The decision was clear. She had to act. But the question lingered in her mind, echoing like a terrifying refrain. How could she confront a man she had thought she knew, who was in reality a monster? The sun set on the horizon, and Valeria sat on the edge of her bed, feeling despair wash over her. The revelations of the previous night had left her breathless, and every time she closed her eyes, the images of Julius and the men on the dark street tormented her. She had seen enough to know she was in grave danger, and every hour spent in the mansion felt like a sentence. She knew she couldn't stay silent, that she couldn't let everything continue as if nothing had happened. Her heart raced at the thought of the only person she could turn to, George, Julius's younger brother. From their first family dinner, Valeria had sensed there was something more to him. Unlike his brother, George seemed more approachable, more human. If anyone could help her, it might be him. That very night, when Julius left again, Valeria made a decision. She dressed quickly, her mind filled with doubts and fears, but also with determination. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. She had to act. She headed to George's room, located in the opposite wing of the mansion. As she approached, her heart raced. How would she tell him what she had discovered? And more importantly, could she trust him? When she reached the door, she took a deep breath and knocked softly. The door opened almost immediately, revealing George, a look of surprise on his face. "Valeria?" he asked, frowning. "What are you doing here at this hour?" "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "It's urgent." George looked at her with curiosity and a hint of concern in his eyes. Without hesitation, he let her in. His room was simpler than Julius's, with a more welcoming atmosphere. Still, Valeria couldn't shake the feeling that the ambience was oppressive. "What's going on?" George asked, closing the door behind them. "You look pale." Valeria sat in a nearby chair, trying to find the right words. Her mind was in chaos, but she knew she had to be direct. "I've seen things I can't ignore," she began, trying to keep her calm. "Last night, I followed Julius. I saw him meeting with some men in a dangerous neighborhood. They were exchanging money, and there were women and children. They were being forced away. George's expression turned serious, and Valeria could see his mind processing the information. "No," he murmured as she continued. "He was involved in something criminal, George. Something very dark. I need to know if you know anything about this. If you've seen anything strange." George ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "I've suspected things, but I didn't want to believe it. Julius has always been involved in shady businesses, but I never had concrete proof. Just rumors." Valeria felt a wave of hope and fear wash over her. Was it possible that George had also been in the same darkness? "What should we do?" she asked, urgency lacing her voice. George stood up, pacing back and forth, deep in thought. "We can't go to the police yet. If we do it without proof, we could put our lives at risk. Julius has many contacts, and he wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect himself. But we can't just sit back. What if he decides to do something before we can act?" Valeria felt the anxiety consume her. "You're right," George said, looking back at her. "We need evidence, but we can't do this alone. We need help, and most importantly, we have to be cautious. If Julius finds out you've started asking questions, he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate you." The gravity of the situation hit Valeria hard. She nodded, feeling a mix of fear and determination. She was aware that she couldn't turn back. She knew too much now. That night, they decided to plan. George became her ally, the support she had been searching for. Together, they began to devise a strategy. They decided that the first thing they needed was to gather as much information as possible. The names Valeria had seen in the notebook, Julius's connections with those men on the street, any detail that could help build a case against him. In the following weeks, Valeria and George began working together in secret. While Julius continued to disappear, they met clandestinely, exchanging information and gathering data on Julius's activities. George had managed to uncover some leads about his brother's business, and Valeria, though scared, was determined to unravel the truth. Valeria also started to notice the growing unease in the mansion. Margaret seemed more attentive, more alert. Valeria wondered if the housekeeper had begun to sense that something was off. Her presence served as a constant reminder of the tension in the house, and though Valeria wanted to draw closer to her, she knew every move had to be careful. One night, after a long day of data gathering, Valeria found herself alone in the living room. The silence of the mansion was almost deafening, and the shadows seemed to shift around her. Her mind was filled with questions and anxieties, but also with a growing determination. She knew the time to act was drawing near. The next morning, as she was having breakfast, Julius entered the kitchen, his presence filling the room. Valeria felt trapped under his gaze, as if Julius could see through her, reading her darkest thoughts. "Everything okay, my love?" Julius asked, with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Valeria nodded, feeling her heart race. The tension in the air was palpable, and the fear of being discovered weighed heavily on her shoulders. "Just trying to get used to life here," she replied, attempting to sound carefree. Julius smiled again, but his gaze remained sharp, almost as if he were evaluating her reactions. "It's a beautiful place," he said, pouring himself a coffee. "I hope you're enjoying everything I've provided for you." Valeria kept her eyes fixed on her cup, feeling that every word was a disguised lie. As Julius stepped away, Valeria knew time was running out. Each day that passed made her feel more trapped, and she understood she needed to act soon. Her alliance with George was her only hope, but also the burden that kept her on constant alert. The truth she had uncovered was an overwhelming weight, and she was getting closer to confronting the monster who had created the illusion of her new life. With a heavy heart but a determined mind, Valeria prepared for what was to come. She knew that the battle for her freedom was about to begin. The tension in the mansion grew with each passing day. Valeria felt like she was walking a tightrope, constantly on the verge of a fall. Julius was becoming increasingly unpredictable, and his behavior filled her with a deep unease. Every time he approached, Valeria could sense the calculating look he directed at her, as if he knew she was hiding something. During their clandestine meetings, Valeria and George began to compile information about Julius's dark dealings. Each detail they managed to obtain was a small victory in their struggle against the oppression they felt. However, every little success also brought with it a new level of danger. The thought of being discovered loomed over them like a shadow, a constant reminder that any mistake could cost them their lives. One night, while she was alone in the mansion, Valeria decided she needed more information. She steeled herself and headed back to Julius's study, intending to search for more clues that could help them. With her heart pounding, she entered the room, adrenaline coursing through her body. The study was an elegant place, adorned with dark, luxurious furniture. The walls were decorated with photographs of Julius at social events, surrounded by influential people. But what caught Valeria's attention the most was a cabinet that was locked. However, she noticed a small drawer that was slightly ajar. Without thinking twice, she approached it and cautiously opened it. Inside, she found documents detailing financial transactions. Valeria froze as she read about large sums of money sent to accounts of shell companies. Evidence that Julius was involved in something much more sinister began to take shape in her mind. She knew that this evidence was crucial, but she also understood that she needed to act carefully. As she reviewed the documents, the study door swung open abruptly. Valeria turned with her heart in her throat. It was Julius, entering with an expression of surprise and anger. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice laced with disdain. "Don't you know you're not supposed to touch my things?" Valeria felt a cold sweat run down her back. She tried to think quickly, but the words caught in her throat. Julius looked at her with an intensity that made her feel vulnerable, as if he could read her deepest thoughts. I was just looking for a book," she said, trying to sound calm. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Julius frowned, but his gaze softened slightly. However, Valeria knew she was in danger. Inside, a rising panic drove her to make a decision. "I know there's something you haven't told me," she continued, feeling it was now or never. "I need you to tell me the truth about your businesses." Julius looked at her with disdain, and his smile faded. "Are you questioning my honesty?" he said, stepping closer. "You need to remember your place, Valeria. You're my wife, not my investigator." Valeria felt Julius's words hit her like a hammer. It was clear he was losing patience, and the danger intensified. In an instant, Valeria decided to let the truth come out, even if it meant risking everything. "I'm not trying to question you. I just want to know what kind of life we're living. Why do you disappear? What are you really doing? I can't keep living with this uncertainty." Julius's gaze turned cold as steel, and Valeria felt the air grow dense. "You don't know who you're messing with," Julius said, his voice low and threatening. "If you keep asking questions, you could get into trouble you can't handle. There are things you don't need to get involved in." Valeria felt her breath catch. That was the warning she had been fearing. Julius was not only hiding secrets, he was willing to protect his dark world at any cost. That night, as she locked herself in her room, Valeria knew she had to do something before it was too late. The truth was consuming her, and she couldn't live with the uncertainty. She needed to act, and above all, she needed to keep her family safe. She decided that the first step was to speak with George again. They had to gather evidence that could incriminate Julius before he could do something drastic. With each passing day, time grew shorter, and the danger more imminent. The next day, Valeria eagerly awaited Julius's departure. As soon as he left, she rushed to George's room, feeling time slipping away. She knocked impatiently on the door, and he opened it with a concerned expression. "Valeria, what's wrong? You look pale," George said, noticing her anxiety. "We need to gather more evidence," she replied, panic overtaking her. "I've seen documents that show Julius is involved in something much bigger than I imagined. I don't have time to waste." George looked at her, his expression shifting from worry to determination. "All right. What have you found?" he asked, ready to help. Valeria began explaining what she had discovered in the study, her voice filled with fear and urgency as she detailed the transactions and accounts she had uncovered. George listened intently, nodding as he took notes. "This is serious," he said at the end, his voice grave. "If this gets into the hands of the police, we might have a chance to dismantle everything Julius is doing. But we need to act quickly and be careful." Valeria felt a mix of relief and fear at the same time. Even though she had an ally in George, she knew they were in a dangerous game. Julius was not an ordinary man. He had the power and influence to destroy their lives. As the days passed, Valeria and George began to work on a more detailed plan. They met in secret, reviewing documents and looking for ways to obtain more evidence. Valeria felt stronger with George by her side, but she also knew that each passing day was a lost opportunity for Julius to discover what they were doing. One night, while they were working, George stopped and looked at Valeria with concern. "You need to be careful. If Julius suspects you're investigating, he wouldn't hesitate to act. He's not just a businessman. He's someone who has no limits." Valeria nodded, feeling the weight of reality on her shoulders. "I know, but I can't just sit back. If there's any chance to stop him, I have to take it." With every step they took, the tension increased, and Valeria knew that the time to act was drawing near. The battle for her freedom was about to begin, and even though she was scared, she couldn't afford to be a victim any longer. She had to fight, not just for her life, but for those who might be suffering because of Julius. And so, as her husband's shadow loomed over them, Valeria prepared to face the truth and the dangers that lay ahead. The life she had wanted had turned out to be a trap, and now she had to fight with all her strength to break free. The sun sank behind the clouds, creating a heavy atmosphere in the mansion. Valeria felt the tension in the air become almost palpable. The truth she had been trying to unravel was now approaching, and anxiety kept her awake. She knew she could not wait any longer. She had to confront Julius before he discovered what she had been doing. That morning, while having breakfast, Julius walked into the kitchen, his dominating presence filling the space. Valeria glanced at him from the corner of her eye, her mind ready for the confrontation she had been waiting for. But as they sat together at the table, the calm on his face seemed to challenge her. "Good morning, my love," Julius said, pouring himself a coffee nonchalantly. "Julius, we need to talk," Valeria said, her voice firm but trembling. He looked at her over his cup, his expression now serious. "About what?" he asked, a hint of suspicion in his tone. "About us. About what you're really doing," Valeria replied, feeling her heart race. Julius set his cup down on the table, his expression hardening. "What are you talking about?" he said, the coldness in his voice becoming apparent. Valeria felt she had to be brave. She had come too far to turn back now. "I know you're involved in something dangerous. I've seen documents. I've followed your steps. I can't keep ignoring what's going on." The room filled with a tense silence. Julius stared at her, a mix of surprise and rage on his face. "You have no idea what you're talking about," Julius replied, his dark eyes filled with restrained fury. "You're crossing a line, Valeria. Don't make me do something you'll regret." Valeria felt her stomach twist. The threat in his words was clear, but her determination kept her steady. "I'm not trying to attack you, but I deserve to know the truth. I'm tired of living in fear. I want to know what you do at night." The tension escalated, and Valeria saw Julius step closer, his body casting a threatening shadow. "I warned you. You shouldn't get involved in my affairs," Julius said, his voice low and cold. In that instant, the room felt like a battleground. Valeria knew she had to challenge him, not just for herself, but for all the women she had seen on the street, for those who were victims of Julius's dark dealings. "If you don't tell me, I'll go to the police. I can't stay silent while you keep doing this. You have to answer me, Julius. What are you doing?" Julius's face darkened, and for a moment, Valeria saw the true anger in his eyes. "You're a fool," he shouted, and the echo of his voice resonated in the kitchen. "You have no idea who you're messing with." In a moment of pure desperation, Valeria realized that Julius was unwilling to yield. He had become a dangerous man, and his facade of charm was just that, a facade. However, there was something more at stake. She knew she had to act quickly before he decided to do something drastic. "I've already gone to the police, Julius," she said, feeling each word liberate her from the fear she had been accumulating. "I've gathered evidence, and I won't stop until the truth comes to light." Julius froze, and for a moment, the rage on his face faded, replaced by deep astonishment. The realization that she was speaking seriously made him step back. "You have no idea what you're saying," he murmured, disbelief and fury filling his voice. "I do," Valeria replied, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "And I'm willing to face the consequences." Without warning, Julius turned and left the kitchen, his figure disappearing into the distance, and Valeria felt time stand still. She knew she had crossed a line, and the confrontation had unleashed a storm. As Julius walked away, Valeria felt she had made an irrevocable decision. There was no turning back. She was ready to fight for her life and for the lives of those suffering because of her husband. That night, she decided she could wait no longer. Valeria called the police, explaining the situation with every detail she could remember. The voice on the other end of the line gave her instructions, and although her heart raced, she felt relief knowing she was finally taking action. In the days that followed, tension grew in the mansion. Julius, though still going out, seemed more cautious. Valeria could feel the heavy atmosphere, as if they were walking on a tightrope. Every time he entered, he looked at her with a mix of distrust and fury. It was as if the two were engaged in a deadly game, and she was determined to win. One night, just before Julius returned, Valeria received a message from the police. They were going to conduct a raid on one of Julius's warehouses that very night. Her heart raced. This was the decisive moment. Everything she had fought to uncover, and all the decisions she had made, culminated in this instant. When Julius arrived home, Valeria tried to act normal. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Julius sat down to dinner, and although he asked her about her day, Valeria kept her gaze fixed on her plate, feeling as if time had stopped. "You look worried," Julius said, watching her intently. "Is everything all right?" Valeria forced a smile. "Just tired, Julius. It's nothing." Dinner continued in silence, and every sound seemed amplified. The kitchen clock marked the time that was nearing its conclusion. She knew the police were on their way, and the moment of truth was about to arrive. Then, the sound of the doorbell echoed through the mansion. Valeria felt her heart stop. Julius stood up, frowning. "Who could it be at this hour?" he murmured, a note of suspicion in his tone. Valeria kept her eyes on Julius as he moved toward the door. At that moment, the tension transformed into a surge of pure adrenaline. When Julius opened the door, the police stormed into the mansion, armed and determined. Valeria felt a wave of relief wash over her, but also fear. She knew this moment could change everything. "Julius Gomez, you're under arrest," one of the officers said firmly. Julius looked at Valeria, and in his gaze she could see a mix of fury and surprise. You did this!" he shouted, pointing at her. "You betrayed me!" Valeria felt fear blend with determination. "I did it for myself. I did it for all the women you've hurt." As Julius was handcuffed, Valeria felt a mix of emotions: relief, anger, and sadness. What had begun as a dream of escaping poverty had ended in a nightmare that was now about to resolve. As Julius was led toward the exit, his gaze rested on Valeria for one last moment. "This isn't over," he whispered, his voice filled with venom. "I promise I'll come back." But Valeria, although scared, knew she had made the right decision. The police took Julius away, and with him, the darkness that had invaded her life. The web of lies and secrets was finally beginning to unravel, and although the path to redemption was still filled with uncertainties, Valeria felt she had regained control over her life. The days following Julius's arrest were a whirlwind of emotions for Valeria. The news of his arrest spread quickly, bringing media attention with it. She found herself at the center of a scandal that had dragged her life from the shadows into the public eye. Although the truth about her marriage and Julius's life was painful, Valeria felt an indescribable relief knowing she had finally made the right choice. The reports about Julius were devastating. The police dismantled his criminal network and freed many of the women who had fallen victim to his activities. Valeria felt relieved to know that, in some way, her bravery had helped save lives. However, the price of that truth was high. The stories that emerged about the atrocities that had occurred under her roof haunted her. During the trial, Valeria became a key witness, sharing her experience and the information she had gathered alongside George. Her courage on the stand was an act of liberation. Every word spoken lifted a weight from her shoulders. For the first time in a long while, she felt she was reclaiming her life, her decisions, and her story. The day of the trial was a pivotal moment. The courtroom was filled with press, onlookers, and victims who had found the courage to speak out. Valeria watched Julius at the defendant's bench, his cold, calculating gaze as if he still held control. But this time, he could not intimidate her. She had decided she would no longer allow her life to be defined by fear. "Why did you decide to speak out?" asked the defense attorney, trying to discredit her. Valeria stood firm, recalling everything she had been through, all she had lost, and all she had regained. "Because it's my truth. And I know there are other women who need to be heard. I can't stay silent while he continues to hurt others." The courtroom became a place of catharsis. Valeria and the other women who had been victims of Julius shared their stories, their sufferings, and their struggles. The courage of each one intertwined, creating a powerful testimony against the monstrosity Julius represented. Finally, with irrefutable evidence and heartfelt testimonies, Julius was found guilty. The room erupted in murmurs and sobs, but Valeria felt a deep sense of relief. She had reached the end of a painful but also liberating journey. With Julius's sentencing, justice had finally been served. The women and men affected by his actions began to heal, and Valeria knew she had done the right thing by confronting her demons. However, life was not just about the pain she had left behind. Valeria realized she had found a new purpose. She decided to dedicate her life to helping other victims of human trafficking, sharing her story to give hope and support to those who had suffered in silence. A few months later, Valeria joined an organization that worked with victims of trafficking and abuse. Her voice became a beacon of light in the darkness, and her story resonated with many women who, like her, had felt trapped and hopeless. Through her work, she met people who had gone through similar experiences, and together they formed a support community that grew stronger each day. Valeria not only helped others, she also began to heal herself, finding peace in her new reality. With each step she took, each workshop she led, Valeria felt more empowered. She had risen from the ashes of her old life. Though the scars of her past would always remain, they were now part of her story of resilience. Over time, Valeria began to see life differently. Instead of being trapped in fear, she moved with confidence. She had learned to value herself, to love herself, and to never let anyone define her again. One day, while speaking at a conference about the fight against human trafficking, Valeria felt fulfilled. She was able to share her story without fear, empowering other women to stand up and fight for their rights. As she looked out at the audience, she saw many faces. Some were filled with hope, others with pain, but all shared the same struggle. And in that moment, she understood that her life had found true purpose. The chapter of her life with Julius had closed, but a new one was beginning. Although the road wouldn't be easy, Valeria knew she had the strength and courage to face anything. She had gone from being a prisoner of her own life to becoming a free woman, determined to make a difference. As she exited the auditorium, she felt a gentle breeze brush against her face. It was a symbol of a new beginning, of a future full of possibilities. Valeria smiled, not only for having survived, but for having found her voice and her purpose. With her head held high and her heart full of hope, Valeria prepared to move forward, ready to face whatever life had in store for her, with the certainty that she was finally truly free. Valeria's story is a powerful reminder of the importance of following our values, being honest, and doing the right thing, even in the face of adversity. From the beginning of her journey, Valeria faced tough decisions that tested her integrity and strength. Trapped in a marriage that initially seemed like a solution to her problems, she soon discovered that the price of that choice was higher than she had ever imagined. Through her struggle, Valeria teaches us that although the pursuit of stability and happiness may lead us down dark paths, it is always crucial to remain true to our principles. The temptation to yield to luxury and comfort can cloud our judgment, but truth and honesty are values that must guide our actions. When Valeria finally decides to confront Julius and do what is right, she not only takes control of her life, but also becomes a voice for those who have been silenced. Her bravery in exposing injustices and fighting for the truth shows that while the path to redemption can be frightening and fraught with risks, it is the right path. The story also highlights the importance of alliances and mutual support. Valeria finds an unexpected ally in George, and together they work to dismantle a system of oppression. This reminds us that while we may face individual struggles, unity and solidarity can create significant change. Sharing our stories and seeking help from others is essential in the pursuit of justice and healing. Ultimately, Valeria shows us that staying true to oneself and to our values is the way to true freedom. At the end of her journey, she not only regains her dignity, but also finds a new purpose in helping others. Her transformation symbolizes that although life may present challenges, we always have the capacity to rise up and do what is right. Valeria's story invites us to reflect on our own decisions and commit to living according to our values, no matter how difficult the circumstances may be. Honesty, integrity, and courage are keys to building a future where justice and compassion prevail over darkness and fear. In this way, each of us can contribute to creating a better world, one where love and truth are more powerful than any oppression. Thank you for joining us on this journey through Valeria's story. Remember that while we face difficulties, it is always important to follow our values and do good. Courage is not only measured by our actions, but also by our ability to rise up and fight for what is right. Don't forget to subscribe, leave your like, and share this message. Together, we can inspire others to be brave and create a better world. Until next time.